And with that, we'll get started. My name is Jillian, and I'll be your host as we discuss today's topic, mitigating third-party risks, best practices for CISOs in ensuring robust security and privacy measures, brought to you by TrustArc and hosted by VIB.
What we're hoping to do today is kind of less be in webinar or presentation kind of mode and more discussion, talk a little bit about opinion, because in large part it's largely what I'm going to express is my thoughts around risk, how I've handled it, how I see it. Some of it you may agree with, some of it you may not. We'll talk in terms of third-party risk. I'll talk to you a little bit about what I think about third-party risk and my perceptions of it. And that's largely where I'd like to take this. All of us know the standard definitions of risk. It's a realizable threat where there's a vulnerability that can be exploited because of the absence or insufficiency of some control, and that there's a likelihood of a consequence. That's the standard definition of a risk. When we talk risk management, we have to add in a couple of components to that. We know what a definition of the risk is, but what makes it a risk actionable? What makes it something that we can do something about? We need to add three more components. We need to ask about whether that threat is material. Now, a material risk is, well, what's material to your business, specifically to your business? And that will determine whether the risk is material. If we're talking about the inability to sell, the inability to take orders, if we were talking about someone was scanning our site, figured out that there was a vulnerability, they were able to get in and access a server that hosted the cafeteria's lunch menu. And they were able to do some damage in there so that we're no longer able to serve out the lunch menu to the enterprise. We had to serve a default lunch menu. Would we consider that to be a material risk? Probably not. It's a problem. It's a hassle. It's not a material risk. If the same thing were to happen to a health institution or a hospital where they have dietary specificities and needs, and they were able to compromise the same thing so that we could not serve out the proper food to the proper people to support their health, that would be a material risk, right? That would be a problem. When we look for what is a manageable risk, we're going to look at a couple of things. We want to look at, is that threat material? And whether there's a likelihood of success or directional improvement if we were able to try to mitigate it. If it's a risk that we can't do anything about it, it might be, it is certainly a risk. It's an important risk. But if we're unable to actually successfully directionally change it in any way, would we give it any kind of real focus now? We might have to invest in studies and all of this kind of stuff. But the reality is that wouldn't be our priority because we couldn't do anything about it. So the third component is to determine whether reasonable action or investment would be prudent and responsible. So as a CIO, you look at this kind of stuff and you say, okay, look, we're confronted with all kinds of risks. Some of them are bigger than others. Some of them are material. Of those that are material, how do we prioritize these? We prioritize these on the basis of that which we can do something about, and a reasonable investment and effort would be a prudent, responsible thing to do. That's kind of how I focus on the management of risk. There's been a lot of talk about third-party risk. Specifically, in the past couple of weeks, I've heard some great presentations. One of them was a talk by a specialist law firm that was discussing the supply chain risks. What are the possibilities? It's a law firm talking about dealing with supply chain corruption and fraud. Big topic, important topic. They gave a lot of focus to that. Another was a procurement and contracts director for another company who talked about how he goes about assessing risk in the procurement cycle. When they're going to buy a product and introduce a product or a service, what kinds of things do they look for? So he looked at that. There's another presentation coming up that I saw that their focus is on how do we monitor continual risk. So there's a lot of thinking about risk that's going on, specifically third-party risk, because it's a major topic for any business. You know, laws increasingly now are going to require us to identify and address material risk. And that's material risk, whether it's internal, whether it's partner risk, whether it's cyber stuff, privacy. And specifically, if you've identified it, also address it and then report on it. You know, so there's a lot of this kind of directional change in our laws that's pushing us to give a lot of focus to third-party risk. Our accountability's increased. Even though changing business models, taking the most consequential of our data and moving it away from our control. So we have the accountability, but we don't necessarily have the direct controls over our risks and our exposures. The technical risks have grown more complicated. We're facing greater difficulties in terms of threats. The likelihood of compromise is increased, and our defenses, in effect, have been diminished by virtue of the separation of data and systems from our abilities to directly handle them. And our trust now involves more parties. It involves more parties. It spans technologies. It spans geographies, regulations, legal jurisdictions, and our protection is paper, contracts. We don't necessarily have the same depth of defenses, technical defenses, because we don't necessarily know where our data is. We don't exactly know how they've spanned it. We don't exactly know what are the end tier of other relationships our big hosting services are associated to. Our only defense is what we put in the contract. And that makes for a paper defense. And we put in terms like, we put in terms to basically say, you know, here's what our expectations of our relationship are. But there's only so much assurance that you can get from that kind of comfort. Let's go to the next slide. Yeah, so, you know, as a, former CIO, I kind of have a broad perspective on, perspective on what I see as third-party risk. I look at it not just as the risk associated with other companies, other relationships, things of this sort. I believe that third-party risk is basically any risk that's out of our direct control or observability, anywhere in our value chain. That's the way I treat it. I also include in that, by the way, internal risk that's not directly associated to our core business. And therefore, it's not easily ascertained. So, for instance, cloud, mobile workforce, remote offices, AI, Internet of Things, the things that we introduce as a business, there is no business that we do that does not involve third parties in any sense of the way across our value chain. But here, when you think in terms of mobile workforce, remote workforce, people are now accessing your systems from home. Who else is using their computer? Who else is monitoring their lines? Who else is standing in their room when they're working? We don't know these things. So treating them, even though they're employees, any different than we would any other third-party risk probably doesn't make a lot of sense. So it's not the question of so much are they related to another company, but the function. There's a separation, an inability for us to see all sides of the equation. And that's kind of what I determine as third-party risk. In any internal product risk, we need to know what libraries and components we use. Where were they sourced? What was the source code? Was the source code peer reviewed? If we don't know all of these things, I would treat it again, much the same. I would go to the head of a department and say, in the same manner that I would say to a third-party vendor, I'd say, you're introducing this new product, or you'd like to introduce this new product. Tell me what we know about it, and then tell me what we don't know about it. And how are we going to protect ourselves in those sense? The questionnaire concept is not a lot different. You start with the casual conversation. You work up towards some kind of deeper inspection and an attestation and all of this kind of stuff, whether it's in-house, whether it's another third party outside. I treat that much the same. It's our risk, whether we're directly impacted or we're impacted by association to the third party. I'll talk a little bit more about that. But like any other risk, third party in-house, third party in-house risk, any other kind of risk, we have obligations, and our obligations are broad, and they span business, they span regulations and what the regulations are asking of us, numerous stakeholders across the business. With any risk, we need to assess it, we need to understand it, we need to address it through effective security, operations, other controls. We need to anticipate its impacts on our budgets, disaster recovery, business continuity plans. All of this is part of how we're going to manage our third-party risk. You've all heard of zero trust, and I'll see if we can hold that slide there for a moment. We've all heard of zero trust. Zero trust is, legacy models of trust were built on the assumption of a perimeter. Zero trust is emerged as conceptually, it's the most secure means of technical operations. Now, it's built on the assumption, never trust, always verify. That's its governing principle. It follows basically three principles: always verify, enforce least privilege, and assume you're going to be breached. So build everything around you as if you're going to be breached, segmenting your networks, hardening your servers, encrypting your data, increasing your monitoring, maximizing visibility of how things move through your network. These are the things that have been introduced in concept by zero trust. In privacy, we have some concepts like privacy by design and DPIAs, data protection impact assessments. They effectively are to privacy a zero trust model. We look at pretty much all aspects of a process, assuming that it, in effect, is not meeting the privacy expectations of the individuals and the law. And we work through each one and we examine to determine whether or not, by default, we're doing the right thing, we're doing the wrong thing. Okay, so privacy by design data protection impact assessments are in effect working the same way as zero trust. But there's a challenge to zero trust. It's a great idea. It's a great idea. But there's a challenge, and that challenge is business. In business, privilege is trust, and trust is the cost of doing business. What that means is, if I were to have a business that collected no data, stored no data, had no customers, I'd have no exposure. But that actually don't work too well from a business perspective. So you have to open up things. We have to collect data. We have to expand to new places. We have to increase our reach. We have to do all of these things. We see shadow IT appearing in each of the different business segments. They're doing things. They're increasing their reach. They're touching things that we don't necessarily know about. So we have this kind of pull between the concepts of something like zero trust and the concept of we have to be out there to do business. And that's increasingly a challenge. It's moving in antithesis. We're expanding our reach, we're lessening our visibility and control, and we're expanding our risk. The nature of business is, we're forced to trust, and that increasingly involves more parties, spans more technologies, more geographies, more regulations, more legal jurisdictions. For us to effectively do business out there, go global, do things, we're going to touch more and more privacy laws. There's now some 200 of them. Add to that the cyber regulations, add to that now AI, and then specific area regulations like healthcare, et cetera, et cetera. It's a very complicated picture. Okay, let's move to the next slide.
And Marty, if I could jump in for a second there.
Sure.
Kind of as you alluded to from a privacy perspective, the concept of privacy by design, of course, and PIAs, DPIAs, TIAs, whatever we want to call those things that are doing some level of assessment. You're right. It always starts with zero trust.
Yeah.
It's always looking at the worst case, the what if, right? And basically we see this obviously, being played out, particularly in the regulations, with a great extent under both the UK and the EU GDPR, right? That really started the notion of the level of assessment that they're looking for, right? Because in every situation, they're looking at what are the potential impacts on the individual rights of that data subject, right? That exposure, that breach, right? What does it mean if that data gets leaked, right? Is it of sensitive nature or not? And we always have to remember that I think the number is some north of 70% of breaches or unofficial access to data is done internally. It's not cyber attacks. It's an internal situation. So this idea of trust, as you continue to explore, is not only an external thing, it's an internal thing as well that goes on and that we need to be prepared for. And I must say, with the rapid rise of the US state privacy laws, we're now seeing it more and more a requirement that you now need to do some level of assessment. And in the case of California, you need to turn it in. You need to self-disclose that to the authorities, the CPPA, which is the enforcement agency for the California law, on an annual basis. So this isn't going to go away. In fact, we're seeing more and more of it, as you stated earlier. So appreciate the ability to comment on that.
Yeah, and as we're seeing it, in just a matter of a short time, we went from 4 privacy laws in the US to 12.
Yeah. If someone had talked to us right earlier And I know all of us were approached in this space and said, what is the likelihood of, this really expanding as far as it did before there was, quote unquote, a federal law, which you and I would agree that that's not going to happen anytime soon, if ever. The notion is really simple, and that is no one would have ever guessed that there were going to be 8 new laws yet this year in 23, and we're not even done. Right?
We're not even done, but by the way, the privacy laws are just the start of the conversation. NYDFS has upgraded its cybersecurity rules. The SEC's put out new cybersecurity rules. FCC is increasing its look at all kinds of things privacy. There's so much law going on right now, and with everybody jumping on the AI concern bandwagon, and all of the laws emerging around how do we handle the AI and what does that all mean for us? That's an awful lot of law out there. That's an awful lot of law out there. I don't know if any of you would remember this, but back in 1970s or so, there was a cartoon called Bambi Meets Godzilla. And basically what it was is a peaceful little deer grazing in a pasture, sipping water from a brook, eating some flowers, and then this giant foot comes down and it says the end. That's what it feels like now in the privacy space and dealing with all of these laws. There's virtually no way to keep up with all of the law that's out there. The best you can hope for is to work through developing an effective privacy and compliance posture. And that's kind of where the understanding of risk is going to take us, or we hope.
So who owns this third-party risk in an organization, Martin?
Yeah, that's a key question, and I'm going to ask you to jump a slide to the next. And
I mean, it's certainly a question that I get asked from a privacy standpoint all the time, and I'm the first one to always state that you can't have privacy without security. And so if you're not collaborating on an active and a routine basis, and when I was at my former employer, a large multinational breakfast company, I basically had a daily call with our CISO at 4:30 every day. And the whole idea was to keep each other aligned. My job was to make sure he and his team knew where the potential risks are based on the type of data that was in the pipes, right? So that they can do the appropriate security around that. And I look for ways to do some consolidation and things like that. But given that we're seeing obviously the evolution of risks, coming into focus and specific to lines of business, right? That's where most of the risk starts from. A line of business has identified the risk. And because of that, we naturally put ourselves in these silos, right? Through the evolutionary period, we put ourselves into the silos. And a lot of it, to be honest with you, in my opinion, is for budgetary reasons. It's very difficult to assign a budget to some topic versus a specific widget or select services. And so therefore, is given that this leaves things almost like to your point, everyone for themselves mentality, right? A very decentralized model, not holistic in its approach. And while that may have worked at some point in our past, is it the right model going forward? And I'll leave that to you.
Yeah, you're right, and you can't have privacy without security. You can have security without privacy.
Absolutely.
You can't have privacy without security. But you can have security without effective operations. You can have security without the reach into your organization, knowing what you have, knowing where it is, knowing why you have it, knowing how you plan to protect it, how long you need it. You can't effectively control your environment unless you know what your environment is. And it's a big part of that question of that definition of what is third-party risk. And, you know, third-party risk is inherent in all operational risk of a business. There's no business that operates independent of others. And whether it's a provider or a receiver of products or services, there's no business that operates independent of others. Internally, externally, whatever. You know, there's no product that we have that doesn't have a long value chain history that goes back to when the resources to build the components were mined, the components were passed on to a manufacturer. The manufacturer passed on, developed a product. We buy the product. We then distribute and sell and all of those kinds of things. That whole value chain involves a lot of parties, many of whom we can't possibly identify. So where does that risk live? Where does that risk live? Because there's so many kinds of risk. There's no singular or best model for ownership. Yeah, you mentioned the CISO. You'd have communication with the CISO. The CISO plays a part. So does legal, so does finance, so does so many different components of the business. And it varies with the industry, with the size of the company, whether you're involved in global sourcing and participate in overseas markets. It varies whether you pursue government contracts. Under specific in-country laws, are you required to have, for instance, a chief risk officer? We don't have a lot of laws here that, although they all recommend it, that require it. The SEC doesn't yet. The FCC doesn't require it. Although all of them advise, but in healthcare, chief risk officers are everywhere. Clinical trials, they're everywhere. That role is increasing. It's becoming more visible. It's becoming a board advisory position. Chief risk officer, because there is so much risk, and there needs to be somebody to get their hands around so many different types. It may fall to a CISO. That's a good place, but there's no specific answer to that as to where it's ultimately going to live in the organization. It really depends on the nature of your organization. Let's advance to so this slide kind of tells you a lot about what I just said, which is that third-party risk touches everywhere in the organization. And because it touches so many different parts, and there are so many different types of risks, who should own that third-party risk management is questionable. It first comes down to the question of, can we define it? Let's go to the next slide if we could. Here we go. As you can see from this slide, there's not only numerous stakeholders for third-party risk across the enterprise, but they participate in a whole broad range of activities and they touch all aspects of the business, from strategic opportunities like merger and acquisition and credit, functional outsourcing to supply chain questions like prevention of fraud and in large companies, making sure that they're not involved with companies that are involved with human trafficking and other kinds of things that we don't want to be associated with. They range from the procurement of products and services to vendor management, how we engage our consultants. All of this stuff is all part of this question of third-party risk management. These things might fall into the company's enterprise risk management reporting responsibilities, and they may have obligations to report some of that stuff to the board and do corporate filings like the 10Ks and stuff of that sort that report on some of our material risks associated with that. But and also material incidents, by the way. But it's a big problem. It's a big problem to get your hands around. There's not one specific skill set that is easily defined that brings all of this stuff together. Okay, let's jump to the next slide. Let's see what we got. Okay, that's a title slide, so we'll go to the next. All right. So from my perspective, as I said, we call it third-party risk. That's for convenience. We have to put some kind of container around it. But it's really some kind of intrinsic peripheral risk that we're talking about that touches a lot of things. We need to recognize that that business, that our business is not static. It's not, our business is not static. Our partner's business is not static. And with every business change that we make, risk moves. So risk isn't standing still. So we've got a lot of moving components here. Businesses that are growing, our business is changing, risk is moving. We're up against a whole bunch of threats. All of this kinds of stuff that's happening makes for a very complex environment. It's third-party or peripheral risk if it either originates from, channels through, or impacts a partner or other third or end-tier party, whether we know them or not, on our side or for our partners. And what does that mean? In effect, we can relatively easily conceptualize as a third-party risk an attack that is channeled through one of our partners to us, and we pay the consequence. That's an easy thing to visualize. But it's equally a third-party risk if our partner is going through some kind of difficult situation, whether it's an attack, whether it's a financial issue, whether it's a legal issue, whether it's any number of kinds of issues. What happens to our partner and their ability to provide us effective services? Remember, we have the concept of CIA, confidentiality, integrity, availability. If the services that we require cannot be made available by our third party, some part of the things that we need fails. Availability has multiple components. Is it available? Is it functional? Does it scale? All of these things. If they can't provide us the services to the extent that we require or that we've agreed in contract or all of this stuff, there's a failure. These are third-party risks. If they impact the relationship between our parties, if they impact the confidence of our clients because of that relationship, any of these kinds of things reflect as third-party risk. So third-party risk is a lot of things to get our arms around. We need to recognize that the business is not static, it moves. We know that. It might be from a component of our business model, like remote access or mobile computing. We talked about that. Who do we touch in that process? Do we use a third party? Do we authenticate in the cloud? Is it a hybrid model? All of these things produce some elements of contact with other parties and therefore risk. Where does it start? We need to classify third parties' material importance? Are they important? And potentially, where can they harm? And how can they harm? These are things that we need to identify kind of in the development of the relationships. Remembering that, everybody sends out questionnaires, and they're important. They're a part of the process. But assessments are a moment in time. An assessment only tells you what we would call an integrity control in the CIA model. They say that with regard to all of these controls that you've implemented to deal with this specific business objective, the assessment tells me that, yes, you have these controls present. Right, that we have some integrity associated with these controls. They're present. What we don't know is how well they're working, how well they expand with the growth of the business, with the change in the business, with new risks that get introduced. We don't know all of this stuff. So we audit, we look for red flags in our business relationship. We do all of that stuff. Most of the time when we look for red flags in our business relationship, we don't find very much, because most companies are in the business to do the right thing. There's probably about 10% of the companies out there that we relate to that are involved with things we probably don't want to be involved with, and that might be all across the spectrum with regard to our supply chain and the value chain that we participate in. The suppliers to our suppliers. There's a lot of N-tier elements in here. So there's probably some percentage of that we don't particularly want to see associated with us. But for the most part, companies are in the business to do the right thing. With regard to the slide on the screen, we've kind of talked to that before, and that is, the slide.
Sorry about that.
Changed.
That was a
Okay.
finger slip.
Okay. Our network of partners, their partners, the technologies we use, the environment which we operate together, it's all one system. One part exposed risks others. I've talked to a lot of companies that, even big named companies, brand named companies, that collect a tremendous amount of data, but don't necessarily know what they actually have, where it is, why they have it, all of the things we talked about before. It makes for a complexity when we're trying to get a handle on risk. You need to go through the exercises, the inventories. You need to classify your risks. You need to classify the potential harms from your risk. You need to classify your processes and your data. You need to know these things in order to get closer to this. But many companies haven't undertaken these inventories or the catalog of the locations where they're stored, all of this stuff like that. Important. We have to take that on. When does third-party risk become core to our risk? This is probably the most important slide here. If it took nothing else away, focus in on this slide, because when you look for materiality in your risk profile, there's a lot of areas in which to look. It's core to our risk if our partners can't sustain an adequately protected environment. If an impact to them disrupts their ability to meet their obligations to us. If it impacts them financially, that shakes our confidence in the relationship. These are all major aspects that drive material third-party risk. We need to take a look at the risk profiles of the companies that you involve yourselves with, and that'll help you to develop a framework around what kinds of things you need to be looking for. from the availability of its functions and services to us, to the integrity of the relationship and the trust and confidence it imparts to our clients. All of this stuff is so key to the security of our systems, the confidentiality of our data, and the data that's been entrusted to us. All of these things, they're aspects of what CIA asks for. We have to do these things. We have to get them under our control. Okay, let's go to the next slide, Paul. Okay. When you're doing your assessments, your red flags, you're doing your due diligence, you're looking at pretty much one of two things. You're looking at a relationship, a company, for a merger, for some kind of strategic initiative, executive level initiative. You're looking to either merge with a company, acquire a company, enter into some kind of new channel agreement or whatever. There's one set of questions that you typically would ask as you try to investigate who they are and what they mean, and how their interaction is going to impact you, your company's culture, etc. Okay, so I've set down one set of questions. There's just a sampling. Obviously, there'll be many more, and you'll figure those out as you go through the process of knowing who it is you're dealing with and what the relationship that you want is. The other side of the chart is, well, what do we ask when we're not looking to acquire a company, but we're looking to buy a product or a service? Again, much the same kind of things. Due diligence is the exposure of red flags. We have to decide whether we're going to move forward with a relationship, require fixes, or end the discussion. The type of questions are going to always differ when you're evaluating a company or assessing a product or service. So, here's a couple. But, due diligence moves through a cycle, from casual inquiries, a phone call, an email, a face-to-face meeting, to a checklist, to attestations, to reference checking, to deep research, progressive investigation that you're looking for to expose some of the weaknesses in the partnership, or to decide that it's fine, we can move forward. And the decision may be different. You may see the same flag, but one company will see in that flag, based on their size and the industry that they're in and their situation, that's a real problem. We can't do this. Another one will say, you know what? Not such a showstopper. We could take this on. It falls within our effective risk tolerance. That's really the question. I put together this kind of model. Let me give you a little bit on this, because as with any risk, business changes, risk moves, so it needs to be monitored periodically or continuously. And the cadence of that monitoring, that's really the frequency of sampling. That's really what we're talking when we talk about the cadence of monitoring. Whether this is for new questionnaires, updated attestations, evaluation of metrics, whatever it is, it's dependent on the materiality of the initiative you're undertaking, the priority of the risk, and your risk tolerance as a company. This is an example of a maturity control that we would structure. Build it into your questions and how you do your evaluation in your inquiries about third-party risk. You use this whether the peripheral risk is external or you're undertaking something major internally. I like to look at these kinds of 4 questions. Even the zero trust model, when you apply these kinds of questions, are we operating under least privilege? Well, yes, we're operating under least privilege now, but will we be operating under least privilege if something changes? So there's a time dimension that you want to investigate for pretty much everything that you do, because things do change. Also, are you aligning your business objectives to the zero trust controls? And are there barriers to doing that need to be cleared or compensated for by the use of additional controls? This is a maturity approach. It helps to align your risks, your understandings of your risks. Let's move to the next slide, Paul.
Oh, sorry about that.
Yep.
So we got about 2 minutes for these last two slides.
Yeah, that's about what we need. I alluded to this control before when we were discussing the checklist for inquiry. These are the 4 conditions of effectiveness. I find this to be probably the most powerful of risk controls because they could be used with any framework or standard. It's not enough to know if you have a control in place. You also need to know, is it adequate? What is the frequency on which you use or test it? And what is the mechanism by which you can validate that it stays effective? Absent this, all you have, regardless of the framework that you use, all you can say is, we've implemented best of class controls. You have no idea whether they're a fit to your environment or effective in your business, or will manage to support you through the changes in your business and your growth, unless you ask the additional questions. Not only do I have I know my business objective, I know what the risks are to my business. I'm looking at the effectiveness of the controls, the validation of that effectiveness over time, and I want that process to continue. It's a cycle. None of these things stop. Okay, you continue to do this thing as a process. Okay, next one. Cloud processing. Like I said at the beginning, your protection now is paper. Your protection is not the technical defense it once was. So you need to make sure that your paper is effective, and your paper needs to look at things like this, like that we have on the screen. What is the nature of the relationship? What is the nature of the data that we're capturing? How do you plan to process it? What kind of resources do you plan to provide? All of these things that, what standards do you meet? Are you in compliance with? All of these kinds of things. These are parts of every privacy agreement now, but more than just privacy agreements. These are key to pretty much every third-party relationship that you look at. You need to make sure that you've covered your terms. Your lawyers are going to be extremely effective at this stuff, but you need to understand what are the questions you're going to ask of them, and what is it that you want back in terms of the guarantees and the give. Now, one of the problems is that we build indemnifications into all of our contracts. You say, well, if this happens, I'm protected from that. Well, there's a reason why that happens. The reason that happens is it's an acknowledgement of the dirt in the system. There's just simply things out there in our third-party environment that we can't know. And with that, let me turn it over to Paul.
Thanks, Martin. I appreciate that. At this time, I have 2 questions right now that I'd like to pose to you. When you say regulation, does any product supported by FedRAMP authorize risk management?
Does any product
supported by
FedRAMP authorize
risk management?
By authorized, do you mean authorize, or do you mean require risk management? And I think that would be the question I would ask. Certainly, there is the requirement for risk management. There isn't the requirement for a chief risk officer to oversee that, but certainly risk management is a requirement. I'm not sure about the question of the authorization or how that plays, but let me think a little bit more about your question, and I'll come back to an answer that's a little bit more informed and get that over to you.
So a customer, next question. So a customer leverages AWS, GCP, Azure, government cloud. What are the risk factors and tools that you would advise?
Okay, I can talk to risk factors. I can't talk to tools. But in terms of risk factors, one of the things that you're beginning to see, and I think and this is going to be pretty much across the board with regard to all of the, Azure's, AWS, Google. We're starting to see now, AWS, I think, is just implemented a lot of privacy by defaults in this, to the extent that data is encrypted by default. We have the ability now to label the data more effectively, more granularly. We have it not just at the bucket level, but deeper in. So these are important things, but the key things for across the board, any one of them needs to be, questions of, can you do, limitations on privilege by at scale? Can you make sure that anybody touching our data is controlled in terms of the privileges that they're allowed? Can we, these kinds of things? We need to know who can touch what privileges are allowed, all of the things that were associated with that zero trust, because least privilege is so important with all of this stuff. The degree of accountability, the use of least privilege at scale. I think these are kind of the driving things that we're going to see across all of these major sources of data. And I think that's where this is all going. But remember, again, our relationships with these big guys is a paper relationship. It's a contract or it's a checkbox. It's a terms of service. It may not even, we may have to research to see what it is we're getting. We may not get to manipulate or influence what we're getting per se. So we need to depend on some of these services. So it's really largely those kinds of things. It's the encryptions. It's the ability to granularly identify your data, know where it is. It's the restrictions on the data. It's the things like the cloud consortiums that will, allow you to dictate to some degree where your data is going to be placed, how it's going to be handled, how it's going to be controlled. That's, I think, how I would answer that question.
As always, thank you